When I first started with no code some years back, I started my journey with Bubble, which is one of the more popular no code tools. But years later, when I discovered FlutterFlow, I knew immediately that this is a tool that I wanted to develop all my apps in. And so if you're like me, you have used Bubble in the past, or you're using Bubble right now to build some apps, but you're considering making the transition to FlutterFlow. And then in this video, I'm going to be telling you exactly what you need to know in order to make your transition as smooth as possible. Now, before we get started, as always, all the apps and all the resources that I talk about on this channel will be available to view and or clone, as well as get more information and support on my Patreon page. And you can learn more about our amazing Patreon community using the link in the description below the video. And so in today's video, we're going to be covering 5 main areas that are going to help you transition from Bubble to FlutterFlow. And these areas are going to be UI, logic, database, plugins, and deployment. Now, right off the bat, there are 2 things that you need to know. First is that you can't really take your Bubble app and convert it into a FlutterFlow app. The second thing that you need to know is that Bubble is primarily for building web apps, whereas FlutterFlow is a mobile-first app building framework. And what that means is that when you log into Bubble and start building your apps, you're seeing a screen that resembles a web app. But if you log into FlutterFlow and start building your app, by default, you're seeing a mobile first display. Of course, you can click here and you're going to be seeing a screen that's aimed at developing apps for tablets, or you can click here and you're going to see a screen that will help you design apps for a desktop. And so what this means is that when you're transitioning into FlutterFlow, you need to think in terms of different platforms, whereas with Bubble, you don't really need to think about that so much. Now let's talk about the UI first. So here I'm logged into one of my apps that I built with Bubble, and as you can see, I have different UI elements, I have a table, I have everything. Now one of the things that you can do is you can double click on any of the elements and pull up this element property panel, and so you can drag and drop additional elements and place them here on the canvas, which is the exact same flow that you have with FlutterFlow. So if I double click on this element, I can configure it. And so, for example, I can change its appearance here. So I can have a static string, or I can have a dynamic string. So I can click here, add dynamic data, and then I can add all kinds of interesting dynamic data that's going to be important to me. Now, with FlutterFlow, you also have access to dynamic data. So I can go back here to FlutterFlow, I can select any element, I can click here, and I can fill it in with dynamic data. So let's say I want to change the name of this button. I can click here and I'm going to be seeing a pop-up that will allow me to populate this button here with some piece of dynamic data. But nevertheless, there's something that's relatively easy to do with Bubble that's a little bit more involved to do with FlutterFlow. So for instance, let's say I want to add dynamic data, and let's say I want to add this field, which is this input search field. So I'm going to select this field, I'm going to select the value, and after I insert this dynamic variable here, that's going to pull the value from the search field here, I have tons of other options, right? I have my operators here, but I also have something called other operators. So I can capitalize the words, I can convert them to uppercase, lowercase, I can format them a certain way, I can do trimmed, I can count the number of characters. There's a bunch of things, a bunch of built-in functions that Bubble provides you right out of the box that you can't easily do with FlutterFlow. And so as an example, let's say I go back to FlutterFlow and I have this button here and I have the same type of search field. Well, I click on my dynamic variable pop-up, and then I can select widget state, and here is my input, which is this input field, which is the exact same thing that we just tried to do with Bubble. And so if I select this input, that's it. It doesn't give me any other options in terms of modifying that data, capitalizing it, uppercasing it, lowercasing, etc., etc. So all of these things that we can easily do using one of these functions here in Bubble, that is something you need to do via either a custom function or a code expression. So in other words, instead of displaying the string here, you need to come back here and you need to either add a code expression and then pass that value as an argument, and then you can do pretty much anything that you want. or you need to create a custom function and pass that value as an argument. So you're going to click here, create a new custom function, and then pass the value that you're trying to manipulate as an argument, and then you can do anything that you want. Of course, in this particular instance, because we are modifying a single text field, a code expression is going to be a much better option. So in this case, you can just select code expression, add an argument, and then set the argument to the variable that you want to modify. So in this case, you're going to select input A, you have an argument here, and then you need to write an expression. So I can do something like var1, and then I need to find the exact function that I want to run against my input here, this value here. And so whether it's uppercase, lowercase, capitalize, etc., you will be able to find that function, but you need to jump through a couple of extra steps. Another thing that's very, very important to understand is that in Bubble, if you double click on any of the elements and you have this property panel that pops up, the only real thing that you can work with is this appearance text box here, right? So you can set the exact appearance according to a specific variable, but you can't really change any of the properties below this text box here to go off a specific variable. So let's say this thing here, this element isn't clickable. Well, I can set it here, or I can unset it, but I can't set it dynamically, right? Same thing for things like opacity or, maybe some of these other settings. Whereas in FlutterFlow, I can do a lot of that using dynamic variables. So as an example, let's say I click here, there's my property panel, and as I go along, you see I can set certain things using a dynamic variable, right? So I can set like things like initial value, I can set font size, I can set text color, I can also set a label, I can also set the font size for the label, I can also set the border color, the focus border color, I can also set the fill color, the border color. All of that can be easily set with a dynamic variable. Whereas if I double click a button in Bubble, there's not a lot of things that I can set using dynamic variables, right? I can set the actual label of the button, and there's probably a couple of things, maybe a color here and there, a color here, but I feel with FlutterFlow, you have a little bit more control. And in fact, recently I've been seeing FlutterFlow open up and increase the number of elements that can be set dynamically. So going forward, I see FlutterFlow enabling more and more different properties that can be set using a dynamic variable. And so as you're transitioning from Bubble to FlutterFlow, realize that you're going to have a lot more options when it comes to customizing your elements while the app is running instead of specifying it during the design phase. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is logic so that you can better understand what awaits you when you transition into FlutterFlow when it comes to creating different logic flows. So with Bubble, all I need to do is double click on an element, and then I can click on edit workflow. So when I click here, I am redirected to another tab here called workflow. And here I can define my workflow. So I can create a trigger, then I can create a bunch of steps that are going to be executed as a result of that particular trigger. And so here we have a trigger when button search is clicked. And so here I can add an action. I can add multiple actions. So for instance, I can click here and I can add all kinds of different actions. And you can do the same with FlutterFlow. So if you go back to FlutterFlow and I select this button right here, I can click this tab here called actions. And what I can do is I can open it up and I can add multiple actions. So I can click here, I can add another action, and here I can search for a specific action, or I can select one of these available actions that are being displayed here. And so let's say I had a couple of actions here with Bubble. So let's say we want to log in the user, and then I can define various parameters. I can add another action, navigate to the next page, and I can specify the page, let's say category or whatever. And I can keep doing that. Now, one of the things with Bubble is that I can't easily edit or rearrange the actions. And so if I go back to this action and I decide that the second action, so step 2, it should be another action, I can't really modify it, right? So I can click here, but I can't really change the type of action that I have. So what I need to do is I need to delete it, and create another action. Whereas with FlutterFlow, you can easily edit any of your existing actions. So let's say I have this action here and this action here, and this action is a navigate action to, let's say, navigate the homepage. Well, I can click on it and I can decide I don't want it to navigate the homepage. I want it to do something else. I want it to do, let's say, an animation, or I want it to do launch URL or something like that, right? Or I can change this to something else. So as long as I have these actions here, I can easily edit them and create another action instead of deleting them and recreating them. Another thing that you can't do with Bubble is you can't easily rearrange the actions. So let's say I have a couple of actions here, log in the user and then log the user out, and then I have maybe send email. So I have, like, let's say 3 actions here. Well, let's say I decide I want to rearrange them. I can't really do that. I can't really easily rearrange them. So let's say one morning I woke up and I realized that, I don't want this action to be first, or I don't want this action to be third. This action should be second, or this action should be third. Well, I can't easily rearrange them. Whereas in FlutterFlow, it's very, very easy. All I need to do is click here, move action up, and then I can click here back, and this action is going to be first again. Another thing that you can't easily do with Bubble is create intricate logical flows via conditions. And so let's say I'm creating this flow and I want to create an if condition, right? So let's say this thing sends an email and then I get some kind of response back or something happens. Well, I want to create an if condition and I want this flow to go a certain way, to go in a certain direction based on this condition here, based on whatever happened here. Well, I can't easily do that, right? There's really no easy way for me to create an if condition other than to have another flow to which I need to redirect to. What you can do, however, is that you can terminate this workflow when a certain condition is met. So all I need to do is go into navigation, click on terminate this workflow, and then have a condition that if that condition is true, it's going to terminate this workflow. Now, I always felt that's a little bit confusing, so I never really used that functionality. Whereas in FlutterFlow, it's all very, very simple and intuitive. So all I need to do is click here, add a conditional. Here you specify a condition. I just have a static true value. And then if this is true, it's going to follow this path. If this is false, it's going to follow this path. And so if you are building intricate apps and you always felt that Bubble was limiting because, yeah, you can have a terminate workflow based on a certain condition, but let's say you want to create an else. You don't want that workflow to terminate. You want it to do something else when a certain condition is. Well, you'll be happy to know that in FlutterFlow, all of that is very, very intuitive because all you need to do is create a condition node, and after that, based on that condition, your code is going to go into a certain branch. So if this condition is true, this branch is going to execute. If it's false, this branch is going to execute. For me, this is a lot more intuitive, and as a result, it will promote you to create more intricate, more sophisticated workflows or action flows. Now, Bubble provides something called a data API and a workflow API. So if you click on settings, and you click on API, you can enable something called a workflow API and backend workflows, as well as a data API. Now, these are awesome features because they give you a lot of extra functionality right out of the box. Now, if I click here, Bubble allows me to easily make all of my entities, all of my data that I have in this app available via this simple API. And of course, I can lock all of this down with security policies. And this is very, very helpful because if you're building an app, and let's say you have another app that wants to access the data that you have in this app, well, that's very, very easy to do with Bubble. Another thing that Bubble gives you is something called a workflow API and backend workflows. So if you go in here and you click on this backend workflows, you can create something called a backend workflow, which is a workflow that's going to run while your app is not interacting with users. So here I can click on general and I can create a new API workflow. I can create a recurring event, which is a workflow that's going to recur on a certain schedule. And I can also do a database trigger event. So if I click here, I can create a database trigger. So I can give it an event name, and I can say type. I can connect it to my data that I have here, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And I can easily have this specific workflow be triggered when something happens to my data. Now, when it comes to FlutterFlow, you really do not have this functionality built into the tool. So for instance, when it comes to this data API feature, there's really nothing in FlutterFlow that will allow you to expose your data to some third-party apps or products. Now, the main reason for that is FlutterFlow does not have a built-in database that Bubble has. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. And so without being able to store this data internally, there's really no way for FlutterFlow to expose an API that will allow you to pull this data back into another app. Now, you can create this functionality with something called Cloud Function, which is a relatively new feature that was recently introduced by FlutterFlow. So you need to click Add, and you can create a Cloud Function from scratch that will give you an API endpoint. And when you access that API endpoint, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can pull any data from any databases that you control, or you can do anything else. So potentially you can duplicate this functionality in FlutterFlow, although it will take some time and it's not something that's built in, allowing you to get started right away. And it's the exact same thing when it comes to these backend workflows. There's nothing in FlutterFlow that will give you a backend workflow that you can trigger from anywhere, or it can be triggered on a set schedule. Once again, if you want to implement a backend workflow, you can do it using Cloud Functions. And just like before, it's going to be a more of an involved process. The next thing I want to talk about is data storage. And this is perhaps one of my favorite features in Bubble. And this is really where Bubble shines, because Bubble, unlike many of the other tools out there, gives you the possibility of creating an internal database. And so if I click on this data tab here, I can define my data types. And for each data type, I can define the various fields, and I can also use one data type as a field in another data type. And then I can click on app data, and I can create actual entries, right? I can create the actual data. So let's say I go into cars, and I have one car here. I can create a new entry here. Let's say this is car, and let's say this is Ferrari. Click create, and I've just created another car entity here, right? So now we have BMW and we have Ferrari. And once I create this, it's very, very easy for me to start using this data. So I can go back here, I can go to my index page, I can go to design, and I can easily list that data here by selecting this repeating group. I can select my products. I can also select, let's say, a car, and I can say, well, I want to search a car. Click close, and now it's going to pull up the cars, and I can also do filtering. And of course, I also have some very, very powerful controls. So I can do count, I can do contains, I can do first item, last item. I can essentially define the data schema, put in the data, and then get the exact data that I need without going into another tool, which is very, very popular. Now with FlutterFlow, things are a little bit more complicated. Now FlutterFlow does support things like Firebase and Supabase natively, but it doesn't really have a built-in database functionality. Now, what you can do is you can use a combination of data types and a persistent app state to do the exact same thing. So let's say I want to store a car entity in my app without using any kind of external database. Well, the first thing I need to do is I need to go into data types, and I need to create a data type called car. So I'm going to call it car type. And next I want to define the field. So let's say we have a name field, which is a string. And let's say we have a, I don't know, model, which is another string here. And once I define this, I can go into my app state here. And here I can define the actual data. So let's say I have a list of cars. I can say car list. And here I can select data type, pick that I want a car type, and select that I want the list. And I want to make sure I select persistent. And once I define it, I can easily use it throughout my app. So here I can come back and I can create a list, and I can select this list, click here, and feed that variable into my list by clicking here, going to app state and selecting this my list variable here. here and then give it a name. Let's say this is a car item, confirm. And then just like with Bubble, whatever I put inside will be repeated as many times as many cars that I have in my particular collection. Now, the main advantage with FlutterFlow is that unlike Bubble, FlutterFlow supports Firebase and Supabase natively. So with FlutterFlow, all I need to do is go into settings and integrations, and I can easily configure Supabase here by clicking here, clicking on enable Supabase and providing my Supabase config data, or by going into Firebase, providing my Firebase project ID, clicking connect, and then clicking auto generate config files. And then once I configure Firebase or Supabase, I'll be able to easily manipulate the data that's being stored in one of these external databases. So that means I can easily query it, I can update it, I can delete it, or I can easily create new records. Now, chances are if you're building any kind of a serious app, you'd want your app to look different than your competitors, right? You would want to customize your app. And if you're developing your app in Bubble, chances are you're going to be customizing your app by creating various plugins. So here, if you go into plugins, you can easily add a plugin that will create some kind of customization, whether it's going to be an element that the user sees or something happening behind the scenes. So here we have an API connector. We also have these Ionic elements, Google Material icons. So regardless of how you're going to be customizing your app, you will have to be using a plugin. Whereas with FlutterFlow, things are a little bit differently. So with FlutterFlow, there are no such thing as plugins. FlutterFlow has 3 ways that you can customize your app. And those 3 ways are either by creating a custom action, a custom function, or a custom widget. Now, the main difference between these 3 ways is that a custom action is something that happens as a result of a user doing something. So if I have this button here, I have an action flow. So if I open this up, I have a flow of actions. And so I can click here and I can add a new action, and I can choose from one of these built-in actions, or I can click here on custom actions and I can create a custom action that will perform something specific as a result of a user taking a certain action on your app. So maybe they click on a button, they fill out a text field, maybe something happens when an app is loaded, or they scroll to a particular position. These kinds of behaviors are all candidates for a custom action. Now, a custom function is different, whereas a custom action is something that the user actually experiences as a result of doing something to your app. A custom function is a specific piece of logic that's done behind the scenes. Now, let's say I have this button here and I want to display the button's label while the app is running. So I click on this button, I select properties, I scroll down to this button text, and I can obviously enter a specific piece of text here, such as go. Or I can click here and I can choose custom functions and I can create a custom function. And that custom function will perform some kind of logic or some kind of a calculation based on the things that are happening with my app as the app is running and as the user is using the app. So essentially I can click here, create a new custom function. And typically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be defining arguments. You're going to be passing something to this function, and this function is going to be returning something. So for instance, I can pass a current user that's using this function, and then based on the user, I can perform some kind of a calculation. So here I can say this is a user, and this function returns a string. And let's say in this particular function, all I want to do is return the user. I'm not doing anything specific. I just want to return the user. I click save, and then I'm presented with a dialog box that allows me to configure this newly created custom function with specific arguments that we define. So let's say I need to pass some kind of parameter or an argument to this function. I'm going to click here. I'm going to choose one of the runtime variables that's available while the app is running. Then I'm going to click on confirm, and then this function is going to perform a certain type of calculation and return a value. And then I'm going to take the return value from this custom function. And just like how we talked about, I'm going to use this return value as a label on this specific button here. And last but definitely not least, you also have something called custom widgets, which is a very, very powerful way of customizing your app. And here's where you need to understand something important about FlutterFlow. In FlutterFlow, everything is a widget. So everything that you see on your screen is a widget. So this is a widget, this is a widget, this is a widget. This whole page is a widget, which in turn contains other widgets. And so now when you look at a FlutterFlow app, you're seeing all of these widgets that are aligned in a certain way to create the end result, which is an app. And if you want a certain widget to behave a certain way, you can easily create your own. So all you need to do is come in here, you're gonna click here, you're gonna select widget, and then you're going to click view boilerplate. You're going to copy this, and right here where it says build, you need to create your custom widget. Now you will need to do a little bit of coding depending on the level of customization that you're looking for. But fortunately, there's tons and tons of tools that allow you to create these custom widgets when you give them instructions. So the biggest tool of them all is ChatGPT. You can simply go to ChatGPT and you can ask it to create custom widgets for FlutterFlow simply by telling it how you want that custom widget to look like. Another thing that you can do is you can head over to pub.dev and you can search a vast library of packages that are essentially custom widgets that you can use in your apps. So as an example, if I scroll down, I see a Flutter favorites, and one of them is a toggle switch. So if I click here, I can see how this new toggle switch is going to look like. And so if I want, I can easily create a toggle switch widget that looks like this by following instructions here. And there are tons and tons of more different custom widgets that you can use in your app via FlutterFlow's custom widget functionality. And so while you can customize your Bubble app by creating a plugin, I feel FlutterFlow's approach gives you a lot more flexibility because you can essentially decide what kind of customization and how much customization do you want to implement in your app. Do you want to have a certain action flow? Do you want to have a certain calculation that the user will never see? Or do you want to go all out and create a custom widget that the user is going to be interacting with? Last but not least, I want to talk about deployment because this is very, very important. So with Bubble, when you finished building your app, or you at least finished building a certain part of your app, deploying your app is relatively easy. You can upgrade your plan to deploy your app, or you can click on preview and instantly see a live preview of your app. And as you can see, we're looking at a live preview of our app. Everything here should work. So for instance, we are seeing the two cars that we're feeding this table. If I type something here, you see this is automatically being updated. I will also be able to search. So essentially all of the functionality that we built into our app. And notice how quickly I was able to go from this screen to this screen. Now with FlutterFlow, things work a little bit differently. So as you are finished coding your app, you're kind of happy where you are and you want to see the live version of your app, you want to click here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a test environment. Now, the first time you do that, it's going to take a couple of minutes because FlutterFlow needs to generate the code for your app and it needs to check if all the libraries, all the dependencies, everything is in order. So essentially it needs to take your app and it needs to compile it before it's able to run it. And so typically you're going to be waiting a couple of minutes the first time you do it. All right, so here's our running app. Now, for subsequent changes, it's lightning quick. So let's say I want to change this button from go to run. All I need to do is change it. Then I can go back here and hit instant reload. And my new app is going to be reloaded almost immediately. And here's the newly updated app with the buttons label changed from go to run. So that is one of the things that you'll have to get used to. With Bubble, the changes you're seeing are almost immediate, but because FlutterFlow needs to compile and get your app together, that initial load will take a couple of minutes, and after that, the changes are instant. But the biggest benefit to using FlutterFlow is something that I didn't cover just yet, and that is the fact that you can take your app anywhere. So once you build your app, you can actually download the source code. And this is pure Flutter source code, which means that you can take it anywhere that you want. And if you finish developing your app, you no longer need to pay FlutterFlow. Whereas with Bubble, even after you finish developing your app, you still need to stay on one of Bubble's plans in order to host your app. And so with Bubble, you're locked in. It's a proprietary piece of tech, whereas with FlutterFlow, you can use it to build out your app, take the source code, host it wherever you want, and do anything that you want. You no longer need to pay FlutterFlow if you're not actively developing your app. Now, hopefully after watching this video, you will see, just like how I did, that FlutterFlow is a much better option for any kind of apps, regardless whether you're building mobile apps, desktop apps, web apps, than Bubble. And if you're interested in building amazing apps with FlutterFlow, then you definitely need to check out our amazing Patreon community, because when you join our incredible, rapidly growing Patreon community, you'll get access to pretty much all the apps and all the resources that I cover on this channel. And that means you can easily view and or clone all the apps that I built on this channel, whether these are really simple apps that are perfect for beginners, or more complex apps that you can easily take, clone, and add some of your own functionality and quickly build a production app that you can easily unleash onto the world. But that's not all. When you join our amazing Patreon community, you're going to get access to some extra content such as Q&As, live streams, behind the scenes content, as well as our Patreon supported masterclass series, where I do a deep dive on a specific topic that the community votes on. Plus, by becoming a member of our amazing Patreon community, you're going to be supporting this channel and supporting my work, and that is highly appreciated. And so if all of that sounds like something that might be of value to you, then I definitely urge you to check out our amazing Patreon community and consider becoming a member. Hopefully, I will see you inside.